Greetings, salutations. My name's Joel Duff. Welcome to the channel, and this has been a long time coming. Some of you know that I've been working on this project. It's the reason why I haven't made a lot of videos the last 2 months. And that's because behind the scenes, I've been working diligently, basically this is sort of a half of a manuscript for a book that I'm working on. And I'm going to be sharing with you some of the chapters of that book. I'm going to be sharing it through an extended long form blog post, a series of 12 of those, which is basically 12 chapters from that book. And then each one of those chapters I intend to convert into a video. And I'm going to call that the Dead Sea Chronicles video series. And this is sort of an introduction to that. I'm going to just tell you what it's about, why I'm doing this, and give you a little preview of the different topics that I'm going to cover. So let's see where to begin. I mean, it's going to be all about where Genesis and geology meet. I've picked this location as an ideal place to sort of ask the question, what does the observations of the world's geological features tell us about the age of the earth? And what does the Bible tell us about those things, and specifically the Dead Sea? Because the Dead Sea is referenced multiple times in scriptures, and therefore we have an eyewitness testimony to what the Dead Sea looked like, or at least the level of the Dead Sea, what the Dead Sea basin may have looked like, some of the cities that were surrounding it. And those give us clues about what the Dead Sea looked like many thousands of years ago. Then we need to ask the question, how does the appearance of the Dead Sea thousands of years ago fit with the geological evidence? And there's a lot of geological evidence. A lot of exploration has been done of the Dead Sea basin. And so we're going to really invest ourselves in trying to understand that geographical evidence. And that's why the long form blog posts, which are going to be heavily referenced, and I won't use all those references in these videos. I'll try to simplify it for the video, but I want you to know that I have done the background research, which exists there in that video series. That video series is going to start a week from this coming Monday, which would be December 9th, 2024. This video will come out on Monday, December the 2nd. And it's my intent, all right, see if I follow through on it because I haven't recorded all the videos yet. It's my intent to release a video as part of this 12-part series every Monday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time. The blog post will be revealed sometime that morning, and they'll usually be a week ahead. So if you want to see like the full-blown version of these sort of book chapters before I summarize it for you in the video form, you can find those also on Monday on my blog, Naturalis Historia. So let's just talk a little bit about what I've got coming up. What are some of the things that you're going to be learning as part of this series? And why did I even think to do this? Come discover the Dead Sea with me. I think it's a really fascinating place, and I've read about it many times, thought about it many times in the past. I've written about it in the past, but this represents a massive, massive expansion of my thinking and applying a number of different questions that I often ask on this channel to this very specific topic of the origins of the Dead Sea. And I'm going to put it this way. I like to think of the Dead Sea as it's a unique geological feature. All right. It's a really cool, interesting place. Right. And if you don't know that much about the Dead Sea, and maybe all you know is, oh, it's a really salty place and it's pretty far below sea level, then you're missing out. There's a whole lot more to the Dead Sea than that, especially if you have any interest in geology and geological history. So I think of it as like this really cool feature that sits at the intersection between scientific investigation, the observations we make of this physical world around us, but also there is biblical history here, right? We're not talking about the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls or Yellowstone or something like that, or Mount St. Helens. We're talking about a place that is deeply involved. It's central to some of the biblical stories. And therefore we have markers, right? We have timestamps essentially about people in the Dead Sea basin. We're going to talk about how far down into the Dead Sea basin, where some of those cities are. and how they relate to the Dead Sea waters. And then, of course, it's going to relate to the origins of the Dead Sea and how do you get this salty sea. And we're going to dive way down deep below the Dead Sea and look at the many layers of many layers of salt that are below the Dead Sea and ask how those could have been formed. So I think by studying the Dead Sea, we can use it both as a natural laboratory for understanding Earth's history, ask really interesting questions about Earth's history, and we can understand it is also a profound place, a place of profound biblical importance. So, the Dead Sea is, as I said, it's this really salty place, right? Nearly 10 times saltier than the ocean. It's famous for being able to basically lie almost on the surface. You can hardly sink if you were there. There's barely any living organisms in there. There's a few microorganisms. So that's why it's called the Dead Sea, right? It kind of feels dead with respect to life in and around it. It's 1,400 feet below sea level. That's a whole lot farther below sea level than, say, something like Death Valley. All right, here I am standing in Death Valley. I think this is 3 years ago in April. So soon after rainfall, which had produced this very temporary lake, all right, which you're seeing the mirror image of the mountains in the background. But that white stuff, of course, is just this flat basin with these salt layers. And eventually this water is going to dry up and the salts are going to precipitate out of it as well. I mean, the Dead Sea is only a couple hundred feet below sea level versus 1,400 feet below sea level, which the Dead Sea is. Here's a whole bunch of cakes of halite, which is hard rock salt, as a result of lakes that formed here in the bottom of Death Valley and then dried up and formed and 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 dried up, many times. And we're going to be talking about, the number of times the Dead Sea has dried up or gotten either larger as a larger lake or a smaller lake over time. And so, the Death Valley represents a very similar place, but again, it doesn't have that historical sort of anchor point for us to be able to really anchor the time scale that we're going to be talking about. So what about the biblical significance of the Dead Sea? I don't want to give away all the good material here. I'm trying to this is the teaser, right? This is just like, give me a little bit of a sense for some of the things we're going to talk about. But this is going to play a really important role. This particular verse, Genesis 13:10, and Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the Garden of Eden, like the land of Egypt, in the direction of Zoar. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Sodom and Gomorrah, two famous cities that were near the edge of the Dead Sea, or, we'll talk about Sodom and Gomorrah in a later episode. And look at the different hypotheses about where Sodom and Gomorrah were. But the point is that Sodom and Gomorrah were very low down in the valley, well below sea level. We'll have to talk about how far below sea level. But the significance of this is Abraham and Lot looking out over the Dead Sea basin, where the Dead Sea is, and the valley running up toward Galilee, which wouldn't have been Galilee at the time. The Sea of Galilee, but I don't know it necessarily had that name. And Abraham and Lot are looking over this valley, and it says, it's well watered. They could see there was a lake down there. You might be envisioning well watered mean it's like, wow, it's like lush. Well watered in Palestine means that there's springs, and springs allow you to irrigate and allow you to grow crops and to have palm trees and things like that. It means there's sort of an oasis there. It doesn't mean that everything is watery. And one of my big points in, I think it's part number 5, is we're going to talk about the fact that what Lot and Abraham saw would have to be something very similar to what you and I would see if you stood in that same location up maybe near Jerusalem area and looked out and down over the Dead Sea Basin. Why do we know that? Why do we think that it isn't any more green then than it is now? Because if it was very green and it was very well watered, then there would be a very large lake there, right? Because there's no there's no place for the water to escape, all right, from the Dead Sea Basin. So if there was abundant water, in the land all around. It would be draining into this basin and it would be filling the basin up. And we're going to look at evidence that actually this basin has been full at one time in the past, actually many, many, many times in the past, but not at the time of Abraham. All right, he would have seen desert mountains with oases at the bottom, making it an attractive site potentially. And there were towns and villages down there. But the Dead Sea is, yes, very, very salty, and the Dead Sea is dropping and drying up. And so one of my chapters is going to be on basically the death of the Dead Sea, all right? The ultimate demise of the Dead Sea, which would be all the water evaporating. We'll talk about whether that's actually possible, how long that would take, and whether it's actually happened in the past or not. Hint, yes, maybe it has already dried up in the past. But now the question for you to think about is when? When did it dry up in the past? Where? What time frame? How does that fit in with the scriptures? All right, we'll be addressing all of that. But the Dead Sea is drying. It's very dry in the area. It's not necessarily that the whole area has become, has less precipitation. It's that the Jordan River just doesn't provide the amount of water it used to. And one of the reasons it doesn't provide a lot of water is because people are taking water out of the Jordan. And therefore, there's not a lot of water getting to the Dead Sea, and it's just evaporating. And so it's lowering. And we'll talk about some of the problems that has caused. And I should mention at this point, I think it's important to mention that you may know that I'm not a geologist, trained geologist. I have a great love for geology, great interest in geology, always been around geology, read a lot of geological material, but it doesn't mean I don't have a PhD in geology. I have a PhD in biology and molecular biology. And so you might be wondering, oh, you're going to write this whole thing and you're going to talk about in detail the geological evolution and formation of the Dead Sea Basin and how that relates to scriptures. Why should I listen to you? And again, if you don't know me at all, yeah, sure. I think you should rightfully be skeptical. I would encourage you to read a couple of my long form blog posts when they come out and see that and check my references, to see if I seem like I'm what I'm talking about. But I also want to point out that I have talked to, know, and have had a PhD geologist review this material. And this is a PhD geologist who has done field work in the Dead Sea Basin himself. And many of the images that I'll be showing you, in fact, let me back up. This particular image right here was taken by him on the Dead Sea shore. And so he's provided me very graciously with a bunch of photography that will allow me to show you scenes from the Dead Sea, in particular, some very important sort of geological formations. And I can rely on him and be able to have him check my work on these things. And so I think that's very important that I have feedback on this before I'm presenting it to you. The other thing that I'm doing is, honestly, I'm publishing these long form blog posts and talking about this here because I also want feedback, right? I want you to be critical of this work because I want to make it better, right? I want to improve it. Think of this as like my first draft. I mean, it's a very detailed, I've gone through a lot of drafts, but this is my first, we'll call it public draft. All right. And so I'm going to see what kind of feedback I get, what kind of alternate hypothesis to things that I suggest might come out. Is there something I haven't thought about? I would love to be able to integrate that into future versions of these blog posts and potentially chapters of a book. All right, so here it is. Here are the 12 parts. And I don't want to, like I said, I don't want to give away, all the good stuff from all of these. This is a teaser. I'm supposed to be making you interested. So I have to give you enough to get you interested. But I want you to come back and, dig into these things with me. So the first one is just going to be the origin of the Dead Sea, a geobiblical exploration. And I'll explore more of the ideas of why I'm combining these two topics together. So again, that's like a much more fully fleshed out introduction to the whole series. Then we'll just start digging into some details. The Jordan Valley, a land literally torn apart. And we'll talk about where does the basin come from? Why is the Dead Sea below sea level? How can that happen? And so we're going to talk a little bit about plate tectonics, right? We'll talk little earthquakes and land shifting around and pulling apart and basins falling down and so forth, right? So that's big, big, big scale, like history. And I'll call it, that's the sort of the secular conventional history of the Dead Sea. And of course, in each one of these sections, I'll be bringing in young Earth creationist sort of ideas and asking questions about how would a young Earth creationist potentially answer these types of evidences that I'm going to bring to you. Here's one little preview. Very few young Earth creationists have ever talked in any kind of detail about the origins of the Dead Sea. They talk about the Dead Sea just in very generic language about it being so salty and a really cool place, and it's important in the Bible and all that. But I've never seen anyone really delve into the Dead Sea in terms of its origins. Maybe Andrew Snelling a little bit, but he doesn't really touch a lot of the data that I'm going to show you. And so that's another reason why I think this is a really fascinating place to talk about, and I think is going to be an incredible challenge for young Earth creationists to think about how they would explain this Dead Sea place. Right. So before getting into like what's below the Dead Sea, which I think is some of the most interesting stuff, we'll talk about Lake Lysan. All right. Lake Lysan, or Lysan, is the name of the lake that used to fill most of the Dead Sea Basin. So at one point you could have stood above the Dead Sea Basin, say you're standing in Jerusalem and looking out, to the east. And what you would have seen is a massive lake, all right, running from below the Dead Sea all the way above the Sea of Galilee. There was no Sea of Galilee. It was combined with the Dead Sea. And I've got to show you all the evidence that lake existed. And we got to talk about how long that lake existed. We got to talk about how it came to exist, what created that lake, and then how did it disappear, and when did it disappear to get to the point where it is today. Then I'm going to explore that even further by looking at one specific thing, one specific evidence for Lake Lysan, and that is the stromatolites. Right, there are stromatolites that are on old beaches, which are way above the Dead Sea today. There are places that are very obviously beaches of an old lake, and there are stromatolites in many of these different levels. We'll have to talk about the significance of that for basically the timing and basically a chronometer for telling us how long the lake was at different levels. Then we're going to go to the opposite end. Rather than filling up the lake, we're going to talk about, or the basin, we're going to talk about when was the Dead Sea all dried up? There was a day, there's evidence that there was a time when the Dead Sea really died. It was very shrunken down to a little tiny, tiny pond, kind of like Death Valley, which sometimes has water, but often doesn't have any water. Although at bad water, there's actually a little pool there. And I believe that has never dried up. So there's always a little bit of water left at the bottom of Death Valley. So we'll talk about all dried up. We'll talk about when that happened, how it happened, and what significance that has in terms of how to explain it within the biblical time frame. Then we go to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. We'll talk about earthquakes. It's a good time to talk about earthquakes because earthquakes are involved probably in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But we'll talk about how do we know when earthquakes have happened in the past. In the geological record, we can see earthquakes and we can determine fairly well like when those earthquakes happen. So we'll talk about that. That's going to be really neat. Then we're going to talk about a giant mountain that's at the end of the Dead Sea, at the south end of the Dead Sea. There's a huge mountain, all right, almost 1,000 feet high, right, made up of, I'll say, almost pure salt. It's just a mountain of salt, a mountain of halite, rock salt. Where did that come from? Like, how is there such a mound of salt there? How did it come protruding up out of the ground? Or how did it get eroded? Or like, what is its origins? And Mount Sodom is also referenced in Scripture. So we know that it isn't like a recent formation. It's something that's there, has been there for as long as people have looked into the Dead Sea Basin. We'll talk about ancient settlements. We'll talk about the history of settlements around the Dead Sea and what has happened to them. And then I'm going to calculate time. I'm going to calculate how long it would take to deposit 2,000 feet of rock salt, 2,000 feet of salt, almost pure salt and gypsum and some other precipitates underneath the Dead Sea sediments that are there today, right? So below the lake that's there is a massive amount of sediment, 2,000 feet of salt, and about 12,000 feet of other sediments, right? So there's a lot of sediment down there. How did it get there? Where did it come from? And then we're going to just start summing it up, putting it all together. Like, what are all these parts telling us? Right? How do we reconcile the Dead Sea's deep history? And then the last question, one I'll spend a lot of time on, it's the longest chapter. How do I reconcile the scientific evidence with Scripture? This is something that many, many people have asked me about my personal view, how I reconcile these things. I'm always talking about, criticizing young earth creationists and why they're wrong. But what is your positive, what is your positive view? What is your view? Not just like what's wrong with everybody else's view of how to take Genesis and meet geology and find some kind of harmony, or is harmony possible? I'm going to attempt to answer that question from my perspective and give you some ideas about where I stand on that. That's something that I've put a lot of thought into. And I'm continuing to think about that. It could be some revisions by the time I get to the 12th week here. But all of this is written, by the way. It's all I have it all laid out, and all the blog posts are about done. It's the videos I haven't made yet. But by starting this video series, hopefully that commits me to actually coming through, on a weekly basis. Meet me here, 10 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to talk a lot about the Dead Sea. So I think that's about it. I think that's the teaser. Hopefully I've teased enough that you want to come back. Haven't given it all away. There's a whole lot more parts of the story that I'm not revealing. I'm trying to save some of my best pictures, and I've developed a whole series of figures to try to explain the geological formation. And so I've put a lot of prep work into this. I hope it'll be worth your time. I hope you'll return and have a conversation with me. I'll be there for all the different videos. And I'm going to be looking for feedback in the comments section. And the other thing that I'm going to be interested in doing is I'm going to be interested in going out on other channels. All right. Will accept invitations to talk about this. I would love to be challenged by a young earth creationist. Have me on your channel. We'll talk about the Dead Sea. You can put whatever question you want to me about that. And let's have a fun and vigorous conversation. So with that, coming up 1 week from now will be part one. Part one, the origins of the Dead Sea. Part one, a geo-biblical exploration. I look forward to seeing you then. Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.